Hello everybody, welcome back. We are moving along in our EBP program, and today we're going to be talking about searching. We've already discussed clinical inquiry, and we've talked about formulating the PICO question, and now we're moving on to the next step in the EBP process, which is searching for evidence. And that's all about asking the right question so that we can find the answers. So we are in the steps of EBP. Already we're at step 2 out of 0, 1, and 2, and now we're going to begin searching for the best evidence. And the objectives for this session are to identify appropriate evidence, to answer different kinds of questions, list 3 of the most common databases that are used in healthcare, and identify successful strategies for finding best evidence. So those are some of the things we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. So one of the most important things related to being able to search well is to make sure you've got a great PICO question. And so one of the things I want you always to be thinking about is, how do you formulate a PICO question? Practice it all the time. So as you're in different situations and you're talking to people about different things, different projects you might want to be working on, or questions that come up, in your head, try to formulate them into PICO questions, So the more you practice, the better. And write the PICO question down and share it with a friend and say, what do you think about this question? And how would you help me refine it? So critiquing other people's PICO questions is much easier than critiquing your own. So I would recommend that you get into the habit of trying to practice PICO question making and critiquing. So really important part for searching is getting good at writing PICO questions. We talked about the fact that there's different kinds of PICO questions, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. In clinical nursing, particularly, we end up with a lot of intervention questions and a lot of meaning questions. They seem to be the categories that most of our nursing-related issues fall into, but prognosis, diagnostic, and etiology questions are also, we have templates for those, as you know, and they come up all the time also. So, our PICO question is all about creating a question that will help you search. The P is the patient population or the problem you're interested in. The I is the intervention that you're wondering about. The C is what you're comparing it to. The O is the outcome you're interested in. And T is the time frame that you're wondering about, and T is not always required, but when it helps to frame your question, use the T. So we're going to run through one more example just to kind of refresh our thinking on PICO questions. So again, clinical inquiry usually sort of presents itself in the form of a paragraph, sort of what you're thinking, and then we have to try to take that paragraph and hone it down to those key searchable terms. So you work in an orthopedic unit in a tertiary care hospital. You've noticed inconsistency in how pneumatic compression devices are used on hip replacement patients, particularly those patients at high risk for DVT, which is deep vein thrombosis, by the nursing staff. When you ask the nurses about the inconsistent use, many of them tell you the patients are all on low molecular weight heparin, so why does it matter? You want to provide solid support for consistent use of these devices, which you acknowledge can be cumbersome to nurses and to patients, so you go to the literature to determine the effectiveness of treatments patients receive for prophylaxis of DVT to find out, is low molecular weight heparin more effective? Are the compression boots more effective? Is it a combination? But what's the best practice relative to prophylaxis for DVT? That's your inquiry. So we're looking at one intervention versus another, so that's an intervention or therapy question, so that would be the template we would pull. And we would say, in blank, how does blank compare to blank affect blank within whatever time frame? So there's our template, and here's our PICO question. In adults with a hip replacement, how does pneumatic compression device compare to low molecular weight affect incidence of DVT or deep vein thrombosis? So now we have our PICO question, which gives us our searchable terms, right? So now we're ready to move on to searching, because we have great search terms. So now we're going to move on to looking for the evidence. And one of the things that we're going to be referring to when we start getting into the literature is what we call levels of evidence. Now, these are usually described in hierarchies in the literature. And there are many, many of these evidence hierarchies out in the published literature. So the one that we are using is adapted from the Melnick and Finite Overholt book. And basically, you just have to know which hierarchy you're using and pick the one that works best for you, but this is the one we're going to be using throughout this program. The whole point of a hierarchy is to identify levels of evidence, and that's based on rigor of research methodology. So the higher the level, like level 1, research evidence, is based on the highest, most rigorous level of scientific inquiry. So that would be systematic reviews or meta-analysis of well-designed randomized controlled trials. Because randomized controlled trials, singular, are the most rigorous experimental design there is out in the scientific arena. So when we have one randomized controlled trial that's really well done, that's wonderful, but when you have a systematic review or a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of well-designed RCTs, then you have even higher level evidence. So that's why that type of literature, if you find an article that's a systematic review or a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials, that's level 1 evidence. That's why it's at the top of the pyramid, top of the hierarchy. And then as you come down the hierarchy, a single RCT, and then well-designed controlled trials without randomization, then down another level to well-designed case control and cohort studies, down, 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 down. The lower you come on the pyramid, the research rigor, the methodology becomes a little bit less and a little bit less. So what you can say about what that scientific study found is a little less powerful because the rigor is less. So that's sort of the background behind these levels of evidence in these hierarchies. So the higher the level of evidence, the stronger you would think it would be. But when we think about whether we find a study to be well done and at a high level, that's the real secret here, is that you want to have a high level study that's well done. You could have a high level study that's not well done, and it's not that powerful because some of the methodology might have been done badly, or things are missing and you don't really know how they did what they did. So we're looking for two things when we're looking at the studies that we're reading about. One is, what level of rigor were they at and how well were they done? What was the quality of the work? Okay? So within the scientific literature, we have lots of different kinds of studies that when you search and find articles, you're going to find you have either quantitative articles that you're reading or qualitative articles that you're reading. So this is how we begin to have to reach back and remember our research class that we took back in undergrad or in graduate school and say, let me remember the difference between quantitative and qualitative, and let me remember the different things that are related to those kinds of studies that are important for me to say, did they do this study well or not? And we have lots of tools that we've developed and that others have developed out there that are very helpful for you to be using while you're reading the studies. But this is a kind of a description of quantitative versus qualitative, and from top to bottom, the kinds of studies that you'll see. The important thing is here, when you search for the literature, what's going to happen is now you're going to have to read what you found. And when you're reading research articles, you're going to have to remember the important pieces relative to the research class that you took. I'm not at all asking you to remember how to do a research study, but you have to remember the major principles of it in order to be able to critically appraise how well the studies were done that you're reading. So that's why you have to do this kind of a little bit of review of research methodology. So if we start at the top of the pyramid, the highest level of evidence is level 1 evidence, and that is systematic reviews or meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials. And this is what you'll find in the Cochrane reviews. Specifically, they basically, that's what's in the Cochrane reviews are reviews of randomized controlled trials. This is a description of what's different about the two of them. Systematic review is where randomized controlled trials, somebody is, they're pulling together a bunch of them and they're telling you what did they all say, or what were the commonalities across them. But a meta-analysis is where the data from the multiple studies on a similar topic are pooled together and reanalyzed in a meta-analysis. And when you create a larger data set from multiple studies, the power of the statistics gets stronger. So a meta-analysis is an approach to putting together a bunch of articles, but there is the additional step of reanalyzing the data in a larger data set. So that's why these are really, really strong studies. If you find one that addresses your PICO question, these are a fantastic way to start. Coming down on the pyramid, the hierarchy, level 2 evidence are those randomized controlled trials. These are considered the gold standard experimental design, single studies, very rigorous, and they are tough to do in a lot of situations, but they are the strongest design to support cause and effect. There is no other design that controls for all the other things that you basically can walk away and say, when you do this, this caused that. And that's what the randomized controlled trials are trying to do, is eliminate the other possibilities and look at an independent variable on a dependent variable. So these are all the key pieces that need to be in a randomized controlled trial. And we don't have enough time to go through all the detail of this, but know that the reason randomized controlled trials are way up on the pyramid is because they have a lot of scientific rigor to them. So when we find an article where a randomized controlled trial was not possible, there was either the experimenters did not have the opportunity to do randomized assignment to groups, perhaps, then you have a randomized controlled trial. You have a controlled trial without randomization. So now we're down to level 3. So what we need you to be able to start doing is looking at the title of the article, the abstract of the article, the methodology section, and figure out what kind of study am I looking at. And that's the whole purpose of the hierarchy, because the level of the evidence is really important relative to appraising the strength of it. So this is level 3 evidence. Level 4 evidence are case control and cohort studies. These are the kind of studies we see in the social sciences, again, when a randomized controlled trial is not possible. Sometimes it's just not feasible or ethical to put people in an experimental group on potentially, a high-risk kind of intervention. So when randomized controlled trials aren't possible, these are the other kind of methodologies you see in place. So you will see a lot of case control and cohort studies in the quantitative literature. So you need to know what they are and what they mean. And then we're coming down another level to level 5 and 6 evidence. These are descriptive studies. So there is a ton of descriptive work out in the literature. So you really do have to become familiar with these and figure out what you're looking at. And so descriptive studies, there is not necessarily a planned, isolated intervention. They are what they say. They're a description of what happened. They're an observational study, a descriptive study, an explanatory study, and oftentimes they're looking at what we did and what happened. But they haven't controlled for all the other things that are happening concurrently. So the ability to say what we did caused the outcome is impossible. But there's still a description of what happened. And particularly in nursing and many of the other social sciences, there is a plethora of descriptive studies. So getting good at reading them, figuring them out, paying attention to the rigor of how well they did them is really important, because you will see a lot of these. And these are the studies that talk about what's happening in the real world. A lot of the other designs that are very high up, the randomized controlled trials and the controlled trials without randomization, those are studies that are taking place in a controlled environment. Well, the real world is not a controlled environment. So when you have randomized controlled trials and they talk about answering the question you're looking at, and then you have some descriptive studies that talk about answering the question that you have that took place in the real world, that combination of getting your question answered in a scientific, rigorous way and the real world way, I think make for a very strong pool of evidence to answer your question. So these are descriptive studies. You'll see a whole bunch of them, but they do not ever say that they can prove causality. And Then there's level 7 evidence. Now we're getting down to the lower rungs of the pyramid. And level 7 evidence are expert opinions and opinions from individuals or committees or councils or special panels that are pulled together. They're generally experts pulled together to come up with a consensus statement on something in lieu of other scientific evidence being out there. So they're considered low-level evidence, but in lieu of any other evidence, they can be very important for you to pay attention to. So, like the IOM, if they came out with a report, a white paper, it's not necessarily an experimental design, but you would, who's on the committee and that sort of thing. Those are the things you need to look at when you're looking at an expert opinion. So they're out there. That's why we have them on the pyramid, but you need to understand where they fall in terms of the rigor of methodology that, leads to the conclusion. So that's just an explanation of the hierarchy, because it's going to be important when you start to read your articles that you remember, what am I reading? What do I have to keep refreshed in my mind relative to being able to critique and appraise the literature that you're looking at. So let's get back to our search now, because now we're going to go look for those articles. Keep in mind that as you're looking for literature to answer your question, for your PICO question, different kinds of questions are going to have different kinds of evidence to answer them. If you have a question that's about the lived experience of a family going through a particular experience, there's not going to be a randomized controlled trial out there, probably, that describes the lived experience of families going through this particular situation. That's going to be more in the qualitative literature. So looking for, a level 1 study to answer your meaning question is unrealistic, because it's impossible to answer some questions with level 1 evidence. So always keep in mind what's your question and what's the best evidence going to be out there to answer the type of question that you're answering. So if you have an intervention question, like our example, which sequential compression devices for DVT prophylaxis versus low molecular weight. Is one intervention better than the other? Or is it equal? Or how do those two interventions stack up against each other? Those are the kind of questions that are going to be answered by randomized controlled trials or systematic reviews, because they are testing one intervention compared to another. So the best evidence, the highest evidence you could find relative to an intervention question, you would be looking for those level 1 and level 2 studies. If you have a prognosis question, you're wondering about, what's the likelihood of a situation progressing from one thing to another, the highest level of evidence you would be looking to find, perhaps some level 1 evidence or level 2, but more likely being in your case control and cohort studies, where people have looked at people with similar diagnoses and looked at how they did over time. And those are the studies that would help you make a prognosis for how your kind of patient is going to do relative to watching folks over time. So more in that middle range is where you're going to be finding the levels of evidence for a prognosis question. And then meaning questions. The highest level of evidence you're going to find relative to a meaning question is probably going to be more in your level 5 and 6, those descriptive studies and those qualitative studies. So again, keep in mind, what kind of a question do I have? So what's the highest level of evidence I'm going to be looking for? You always want to look for the highest level, because that's the strongest evidence you have. But don't overestimate what the possibilities are. So always keep in mind, what kind of a question do I have and what should I be looking for?